Irritable heart. On the first day of autumn 1998, Florence Griffith Joyner, former Olympic track gold medalist, died in her sleep at the age of 38, when her heart stopped beating. That same fall, Canadian ice hockey player Stéphane Marin, age 29, died of sudden heart failure during a hockey game in Germany, leaving behind a wife and newborn son. Chad Silver, who had played on the Swiss national ice hockey team, also aged 29, died of a heart attack. Former Tampa Bay Buccaneers nose tackle Dave Logan collapsed and died from the same cause. He was 42. None of these athletes had any history of heart disease. A decade later, responding to mounting alarm among the sports community, the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation created a national registry of sudden deaths in athletes. After combing through public records, news reports, hospital archives, and autopsy records, the foundation identified 1,049 American athletes in 38 competitive sports who had suffered sudden cardiac arrest between 1980 and 2006. The data confirmed what the sports community already knew. In 1980, heart attacks in young athletes were rare. Only 9 cases occurred in the United States. The number rose gradually but steadily, increasing about 10% per year until 1996, when the number of cases of fatal cardiac arrest among athletes suddenly doubled. There were 64 that year and 66 the following year. In the last year of the study, 76 competitive athletes died when their hearts gave out, most of them under 18 years of age. The American medical community was at a loss to explain it. But in Europe, some physicians thought they knew the answer not only to the question of why so many young athletes' hearts could no longer stand the strain of exertion, but to the more general question of why so many young people were succumbing to diseases from which only old people used to die. On October 9, 2002, an association of German doctors specializing in environmental medicine began circulating a document calling for a moratorium on antennas and towers used for mobile phone communications. Electromagnetic radiation, they said, was causing a drastic rise in both acute and chronic diseases, prominent among which were extreme fluctuations in blood pressure, heart rhythm disorders, and heart attacks and strokes among an increasingly younger population. 3,000 physicians signed this document, named the Freiburger Appeal after the German city in which it was drafted. The analysis, if correct, could explain the sudden doubling of heart attacks among American athletes in 1996. That was the year digital cell phones first went on sale in the United States, and the year cell phone companies began building tens of thousands of cell towers to make them work. Although I knew about the Freiburger Appeal and the profound effects electricity could have on the heart, when I first conceived this book, I did not intend to include a chapter on heart disease, for I was still in denial despite the abundant evidence. We recall from Chapter 8 that Marconi, the father of radio, had 10 heart attacks after he began his changing work, including the one that killed him at the young age of 63. Anxiety disorder, which is rampant today, is most often diagnosed from its cardiac symptoms. Many suffering from an acute anxiety attack have heart palpitations, shortness of breath, and pain or pressure in the chest, which so often resemble an actual heart attack that hospital emergency rooms are visited by more patients who turn out to have nothing more than anxiety than by patients who prove to have something wrong with their hearts. And yet we recall from chapter 6 that anxiety neurosis was an invention of Sigmund Freud, a renaming of a disease formerly called neurasthenia that became prevalent only in the late 19th century following the building of the first electrical communication systems. Radio wave sickness described by Russian doctors in the 1950s includes cardiac disturbances as a prominent feature. Not only did I know of this, but I myself have suffered for 35 years from palpitations, abnormal heart rhythm, shortness of breath, and chest pain related to exposure to electricity. Yet, when my friend and colleague Jolie Andritzakis suggested to me that heart disease itself had appeared in the medical literature for the first time at the beginning of the 20th century and that I should write a chapter about it, I was taken by surprise. In medical school, I had had it so thoroughly drilled into me that cholesterol is the main cause of heart disease that I had never before questioned the wisdom that bad diet and lack of exercise are the most important factors contributing to the modern epidemic. I had no doubt that electromagnetic radiation could cause heart attacks, but I did not yet suspect that it was responsible for heart disease. Then another colleague, Dr. Samuel Milham, muddied the waters some more. Milham is an MD and an epidemiologist retired from the Washington State Department of Health. He wrote an article in 2010, followed by a short book suggesting that the modern epidemics of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer are largely, if not entirely, caused by electricity. He included solid statistics to back up these assertions. I decided to dive in. I first became aware of Milham's work in 1996 when I was asked to help with a national lawsuit against the Federal Communications Commission. I was still living in Brooklyn and knew only that the telecommunications industry was promising a wireless revolution. The industry wanted to place a cell phone in the hands of every American, and in order to make those devices work in the urban canyons of my hometown, they were applying for permission to erect thousands of microwave antennas close to street level throughout New York. Advertisements for the newfangled phones were beginning to appear on radio and television, telling the public why they needed such things and that they would make ideal Christmas gifts. I did not have any idea how radically the world was about to change. Then came a phone call from David Fichtenberg, a statistician in Washington state, who told me the FCC had just released human exposure guidelines for microwave radiation and asked if I wanted to join a nationwide legal challenge against them. The new guidelines, I came to find out, had been written by the cell phone industry itself and did not protect people from any of the effects of microwave radiation except one: being cooked like a roast in a microwave oven. None of the known effects of such radiation, apart from heat effects on the heart, nervous system, thyroid gland, and other organs, were taken into consideration. Worse, Congress had passed a law that January that actually made it illegal for cities and states to regulate this new technology on the basis of health. President Clinton had signed it on February 8. The industry, the FCC, Congress, and the president were conspiring to tell us that we should all feel comfortable holding devices that emit microwave radiation directly against our brains, and that we should all get used to living in close quarters with microwave towers because they were coming to a street near you whether you like it or not. A giant biological experiment had been launched, and we were all going to be unwitting guinea pigs. Except that the outcome was already known. The research had been done, and the scientists who had done it were trying to tell us what the new technology was going to do to our brains of cell phone users and to the hearts and nervous systems of people living in the vicinity of cell towers, which one day soon was going to be everybody. Samuel Milham Jr. was one of those researchers. He had not done any of the clinical or experimental research on individual humans or animals. Such work had been done by others in previous decades. Milham is an epidemiologist, a scientist who proves that the results obtained by others in the laboratory actually happen to masses of people living in the real world. In his early studies, he had shown that electricians, power line workers, telephone linesmen, aluminium workers, radio and TV repairmen, welders, and amateur radio operators, those whose work exposed them to electricity or electromagnetic radiation, died far more often than the general public from leukemia, lymphoma, and brain tumors. You know that the new FCC standards were inadequate, and he made himself available as a consultant to those who were challenging them in court. In recent years, Milham turned his skills to the examination of vital statistics from the 1930s and 1940s, when the Roosevelt administration made it a national priority to electrify every farm and rural community in America. What Milham discovered surprised even him. Not only cancer he found, but also diabetes and heart disease seemed to be directly related to residential electrification. Rural communities that had no electricity had little heart disease until electric service began. In fact, in 1940s, country folk in electrified regions of the country were suddenly dying of heart disease 4 to 5 times as frequently as those who still lived out of electricity's reach. It seems unbelievable that mortality differences of this magnitude could go unexplained for over 70 years after they were first reported, wrote Milham. He speculated that early in the 20th century nobody was looking for answers. But when I began reading the early literature, I found that everyone was looking for answers. Paul Dudley White, for example, a well-known cardiologist associated with Harvard Medical School, puzzled over the problem in 1938. In the second edition of his textbook Heart Disease, he wrote in amazement that Austin Flint, a prominent physician practicing internal medicine in New York City during the last half of 19th century, had not encountered a single case of angina pectoris, chest pain due to heart disease, for one period of 5 years. White was provoked by the tripling of heart disease rates in his home state of Massachusetts since he had begun practicing in 1911. As a cause of death, he wrote, heart disease has assumed greater and greater proportions in this part of the world until now it leads all other causes, having far outstripped tuberculosis, pneumonia, and malignant disease. In 1970, at the end of his career, White was still unable to say why this was so. All he could do was wonder at the fact that coronary heart disease, disease due to clogged coronary arteries, which is the most common type of heart disease today, had once been so rare that he had seen almost no cases in his first few years of practice. Of the first 100 papers I published, he wrote, only two at the end of the 100 were concerned with coronary heart disease. Heart disease had not, however, sprung full blown from nothing at the turn of the 19th century. It had been relatively uncommon but not unheard of. The vital statistics of the United States show that rates of heart disease had begun to rise long before White graduated from medical school. The modern epidemic actually began quite suddenly in the 1870s, at the same time as the first great proliferation of telegraph wires. But that is to jump ahead of myself. For the evidence that heart disease is caused primarily by electricity is even more extensive than Milham suspected, and the mechanism by which electricity damages the heart is known. To begin with, we need not to rely only on historical data for evidence supporting Milham's proposal, for electrification is still going on in a few parts of the world. From 1984 to 1987, scientists at the Sitaram Bhatia Institute of Science and Research decided to compare rates of coronary heart disease in Delhi, India, which were disturbingly high, with rates in rural areas of Jurjan district in Haryana state 50 to 70 kilometers away. 27,000 people were interviewed, and as expected, the researchers found more heart disease in the city than in the country. But they were surprised by the fact that virtually all of the supposed risk factors were actually greater in the rural districts. City dwellers smoked much less. They consumed fewer calories, less cholesterol, and much less saturated fat than their rural counterparts. Yet, they had 5 times as much heart disease. It is clear from the present study, wrote the researchers, that the prevalence of coronary heart disease and its urban-rural differences are not related to any particular risk factor, and it is therefore necessary to look for other factors beyond the conventional explanations. The most obvious factor that these researchers did not look at was electricity. For in the mid 1980s, the Jurgen district had not yet been electrified. In order to make sense of these kinds of data, it is necessary to review what is known and what is still not known about heart disease, electricity, and the relationship between the two. My Hungarian grandmother, who was the main cook in my family while I was growing up, had arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. She fed us the same meals she cooked for herself, and at the advice of her doctor, they were low in fat. She happened to be a marvelous cook, so after I left home, I continued eating in a similar style because I was hooked on the taste. For the past 38 years, I had also been a vegetarian. I feel healthiest eating this way, and I believe that it is good for my heart. However, soon after I began to do research for this chapter, a friend gave me a book to read titled The Cholesterol Myths. It was published in 2000 by Danish physician Uffe Raunskov, a specialist in internal medicine and kidney disease and a retired family practice doctor living in Lund, Sweden. I resisted reading it because Lavnskov is not unbiased. He thinks vegetarians are pleasure avoiding stoics who heroically deny themselves the taste of proper food in the mistaken belief that this will make them live longer. Ignoring his prejudices, I eventually read Ramskov's book and found it well researched and thoroughly referenced. It demolishes the idea that people are having more heart attacks today because they're stuffing themselves with more animal fat than their ancestors did. On its surface, his thesis is contrary to what I was taught as well as to my own experience. So I obtained copies of many of the studies he quoted and read them over and over until they finally made sense in light of what I knew about electricity. The most important thing to keep in mind is that the early studies did not have the same outcome as research being done today, and that there is a reason for this difference. Even recent studies from different parts of the world do not always agree with each other for the same reason. Roundskov, however, has become something of an icon among portions of the alternative health community, including many environmental physicians who are now prescribing high fat diets, emphasizing animal fats to their severely ill patients. They're misreading the medical literature. The studies that Ravnskov relied on show unequivocally that some factors other than diet is responsible for the modern scourge of heart disease. But they also show that cutting down on dietary fat in today's world helps to prevent the damage caused by that other factor. Virtually every large study done since the 1950s in the industrialized world, agreeing with what I was taught in medical school, has shown a direct correlation between cholesterol and heart disease. And every study comparing vegetarians to meat eaters has found that vegetarians today have both lower cholesterol levels and a reduced risk of dying from a heart attack. Ravanskov speculated that this is because people who eat no meat are also more health conscious in other ways. But the same results have been found in people who are vegetarians only by religious reasons. Seventh day Adventists all abstain from tobacco and alcohol, but only about half abstain from meat. A number of large long term studies have shown that Adventists who are also vegetarians are 2 to 3 times less likely to die from heart disease. Perplexingly, the very early studies, those done in the first half of the 20th century, did not give these kinds of results and did not show that cholesterol was related to heart disease. To most researchers, this has been an insoluble paradox contradicting present ideas about diet and has been a reason for the mainstream medical community to dismiss the early research. For example, people with a genetic trait called familial hypercholesterolemia have extremely high levels of cholesterol in their blood, so high that they sometimes have fatty growths on their joints and are prone to gout-like attacks in toes, ankles, and knees caused by cholesterol crystals. In today's world, these people are prone to dying young of coronary heart disease. However, this was not always so. Researchers at Leiden University in the Netherlands traced the ancestors of 3 present-day individuals with this disorder until they found a pair of common ancestors who lived in the late 18th century. Then, by tracing all descendants of this pair and screening all living descendants for the defective gene, they were able to identify 412 individuals who either had definitely carried the gene and passed it on, or who were siblings who had a 50% chance of carrying it. They found to their amazement that before the 1860s, people with this trait had a 50% lower mortality rate than the general population. In other words, cholesterol seemed to have had protective value, and people with very high cholesterol levels lived longer than average. Their mortality rate, however, rose steadily during the late 19th century until it equaled the rate of the general population in about 1915. The mortality of this subgroup continued rising during the 20th century, reaching double the average during the 1950s and then leveling off somewhat. One can speculate, based on this study, that before the 1860s, cholesterol did not cause coronary heart disease, and there is other evidence that this is so. In 1965, Leon Michaels, working at the University of Manitoba, decided to see what historical documents revealed about fat consumption in previous centuries when coronary heart disease was extremely rare. What he found also contradicted current wisdom and convinced him that there must be something wrong with the cholesterol theory. One author in 1696 had calculated that the wealthier half of the English population, or about 2.7 million people, ate an amount of flesh yearly averaging 147.5 pounds per person, more than the national average for meat consumption in England in 1962. Nor did the consumption of animal fats decline at any time before the 20th century. Another calculation made in 1901 had shown that the servant-keeping class of England consumed on average a much larger amount of fat in 1900s than they did in 1950. Michaels did not think that lack of exercise could explain the modern epidemic of heart disease either, because it was among the ideal upper class who had never engaged in manual labor and who were eating much less fat than they used to, that heart disease had increased the most. Then there was the incisive work of Jeremiah Morris, professor of social medicine at the University of London, who observed that in the first half of the 20th century, coronary heart disease had increased while coronary atheroma, cholesterol plaques in the coronary arteries, had actually decreased. Morris examined the autopsy records at London Hospital from the years 1908 through 1949. In 1908, 30.4% of all autopsies in men aged 30 to 70 showed advanced atheroma. In 1949, only 16%. In women, the rate had fallen from 25.9% to 7.5%. In other words, cholesterol plaques in coronary arteries were far less common than before, but they were contributing to more disease, more angina, and more heart attacks. By 1961, when Morris presented a paper about the subject at Yale University Medical School, studies conducted in Framingham, Massachusetts, and Albany, New York, had established a connection between cholesterol and heart disease. Morris was sure that some other unknown environmental factor was also important. It is tolerably certain, he told his audience, that more than fats in the diet affect blood lipid levels. More than blood lipid levels are involved in atheroma formation, and more than atheroma is needed for ischemic heart disease. That factor, as we will see, is electricity. Electromagnetic fields have become so intense in our environment that we are unable to metabolize fats the way our ancestors could. However, environmental factor was affecting human beings in America during the 1930s and 1940s, was also affecting all the animals in the Philadelphia Zoo. The Laboratory of Comparative Pathology was a unique facility founded at the zoo in 1901, and from 1916 to 1964, Laboratory Director Herbert Fox and his successor Herbert L. Redschiff kept complete records of autopsies performed on over 13,000 animals that had died in the zoo.